Today's entry is going to be a two-parter because later on today, coming in the mail, I should receive the Columbian Ladies and Gentlemen's Magazine, Volume 3, which is 1845, in which Some Words with a Mummy, which is attributed to Edgar Allan Poe, was supposed to be printed. It was announced in the January edition of this monthly magazine, but it never showed up in there. And then in April, Edgar Allan Poe's edition appeared in American Review. But Matthew had a presence in that first magazine, the Columbian, unsigned presence, but I can show by style that it was his work. One piece definitely, and I think two or three. They're like little biographies, little mini biographies. So the question is, how did that go down? Because that was originally Matthew's story, I'm sure of it. And Edgar Allan Poe very heavily modified it. So, I was just thinking about that. And I think what happened is it's like a case of identity theft. I think that Matthew submitted it about the same time that he submitted The Raven to American Review. And Poe may have known the editors of the Columbian. And he may have gotten word that this story had been submitted to them. And he said, oh, no, that's my story. And, somebody has plagiarized me. So it was like a reverse, identity theft. Or he could have said, oh, that's my story. I can prove it because here's my manuscript, which he had copied over. And I've decided I want to revise it. So they withheld it. And then he submitted it to American Review. I don't know exactly how it went down, but I'm guessing the one that was originally submitted to the Columbian was Matthew's original version. Of course, we don't know because none of that stuff's been retained. Well, I've got my detective hat on for that one. But this morning, fairly early this morning, it's like 4:30, I want to read a poem, and I'm not going to try to prove anything because I want to try to convey the poem itself, the skill and beauty of this poem. This is by Abby Poyen, Matthew's future wife. It was published in the American Monthly Magazine of July 1830, but I'm not so sure she's the one that submitted it. It's signed AP. It's one of several. I think that her classroom teacher, Albert Pike, in 1830, was stealing her poetry out of her workbook and submitting it. And I think that his idea was if he got caught, he could say he was submitting it for his student, since they had the same initials. If he didn't get caught, he could take the money and the fame, and that's what he did. He claimed all of these poems for himself, including the Hymns to the Gods series, some of which he modified. Later on, he completely reworked these things. But originally, this was Abby Poyen at age 14. And this particular poem, which I happened to read yesterday, struck me as especially beautiful. So now I seem to have left my glasses somewhere. Here they are. I want to read this poem, and I could prove to you that this is Abby Poyen's poem if I wanted to. I could show you something that definitely wasn't Pike's, that was published by Matthew posthumously in 1850. That's definitely Abby's, same signature, same style, same everything, and it can't possibly be Albert Pike. I could show you, more of Abby's writing, and it's basically, on the face of it, it's absurd, because Pike was, a big man's man who was a con artist, and he fought as a general for the South, even though he was born in Massachusetts, in the Civil War, and he became a 33-degree Mason, that he taught some kind of Luciferianism, and he plagiarized like crazy and actually admitted it in his work that he wrote for the Masons, bragged on it basically. And it's just, there's no way that it's a match for this poetry. So it's kind of an obvious thing, but again, it's like possession is 9/10 of the law, or 9 points of the law. And once somebody gets their name historically attached to something, it's like trying to get a tick out of your skin, trying to get these people to let go of these pieces. But that's not my point here. This poem is called Love. And if at all possible, I'm going to try to read it with the intention of conveying the deeper essence of it. If you followed any of these entries, you know that Abby was a mystic, even at age 14, deeply studied in mysticism and esoteric matters, that she loved the stars. She's written about fairies. Matthew has written about her as a fairy or a sprite. And what she's talking about here is the spirit of love, because she believes that God is immanent in creation. See, so that as a mystic, that's what she's writing about, is the spirit of love flowing through everything. See, everyone and everything. So without further ado, I'm going to read this. I'm going to put it up on the screen. And this is not about proof. There's no question. This is not Albert Pike. This is Abby Poyen at age 14. And here we go. Love. There came a train on a pleasant eve of clouds beneath the moon, like the mists that the fairies at nightfall weave, and go with appealing tune, and spread about on the springing grass, where they all starry nights do pass, and sleep at the hottest noon. Yea, golden clouds were waving about beneath the many-eyed sky, and heads with glittering eyes were thrust out, and golden locks that waved wildly about, and shaded each burning eye. And a sunny form bent down from the air, with eyes that looked into the soul, and drapery floating about him as rare as the scents that the south wind roll. And he spake, while the heavens were mute and still, in a voice as soft as a gliding rill, through a bed of summer flowers, that goes along with quiet thrill, like a lake in summer showers. I am felt all over the smiling earth, as I step with joy and glee, and all hearts swell with a flush of mirth where tidings come of me. My steps are over the mountain heights, stirring the joyous trees, and deep in the glen, in the lowly flight of the pleasant summer breeze, I shake my locks o'er the eagle's nest, far up on the sunlit mountain, and over the quiet and sleeping breast of the star-enlightened fountain. I send my gaze to the deepest nooks of ancient forest haunts, and the wren joys at me with pleasant looks, and the weary doe that pants with her flight through the woods lights up her eye with a stronger fire as my power comes by. My music is many a song that swells in a summer eve o'er the starlighted dells, and over the lakes and the sleeping woods, where night like a dove on the great trees broods, and over the mountains and up to the sky, like a heaven-nourished melody, 'tis the low, sweet tone that you often hear if you watch for it with a lover's ear. 'Tis every sound that is light and sweet, that comes on the air with its silver feet, and touches the chords of the thrilling heart with fingers invisible. I have part in all that is beautiful, tender, or sweet, in all that the senses and soul doth greet. With a thrill of pleasure I sit on the clouds, and gaze on the earth with a piercing eye on the sunny flowers, and among the crowds of the rustling leaves as I pass them by. And there is my throne, all joy is mine that around the heart doth ever twine, and sit in its depths. My name is writ on the glowing stars that smile as they sit forever up in the sky. It is written upon the bright beams of the sun, on the streams that sparkle and leap as they run, on the wings of the south wind, all incense laden, in the eyes of the blushing and timorous maiden. On all things around us, below and above, you may read in bright letters the name of love. Now we're going to go into detective mode. And I was going to wait for my antiquarian copy of the Columbian magazine from 1845 to come in the mail, but this being Monday, the mail could be somewhat late. So I thought what I'd do is get through the background, because there's quite a bit of background. And what we're talking about here is that Matthew Franklin Whittier was the original author, as I believe, of Some Words with a Mummy, which is claimed for and was claimed by Edgar Allan Poe. The instant I saw that story, immediately I recognized it as one of my own past life literary children. There was no question about it. The problem is I haven't emphasized it because it's very difficult to prove. But what I'm going to do today, on the occasion of my receiving in Columbian Magazine, is to go through the evidence. There's circumstantial evidence that definitely points to it. It's just that I don't have any smoking guns like I do for The Raven. However, if Matthew was the real author of The Raven, and if he was the real author of Annabel Lee, then it's very likely that, given the style comparisons and all the circumstantial evidence, that he was also the real author of Some Words with a Mummy. Now, let's see. I'm going to take my time and really go easy with this. If I go fast, I start stumbling all over myself like I did in a recent podcast. So I don't want to miss anything, and I don't want to feel rushed. This is American Review, and it is the first 6 months of American Review. It includes The Raven, but in the April edition, it also includes Some Words with a Mummy, signed by Edgar Allan Poe. And note that this magazine, which supposedly required people to submit anonymously, now he's got his name attached to this thing. There it is. Like I said, when I read this, I said, that's Matthew's. There's no question. I had thought when I read it before that it wasn't that much in Matthew's style, and he must have edited it, revised it quite heavily. But I just read it this morning, and I don't think so now. I'm of the opinion this is pretty much the way Matthew wrote it, except that Poe added the last paragraph as the final conclusion of it. I think that just like in A Christmas Carol, where Matthew and Abby's ending was the second to last paragraph, I think that's happened here. So I'm not going to read it. What I'm going to do is to go through my notes in a little bit. But the first thing I want to do is establish that Matthew wrote in this style. Now, when I get into this and look at one of the clues, it has to do with a particular type of battery, and that battery was invented like in 1800. But then by 1836, there were new ones. So if the writer, certainly if Matthew had written this story, he would have made a reference to the most current invention, the most current type of battery that had been invented, which is not the case here. So while this was published by Poe in 1845, I think it was written by Matthew Franklin Whittier in 1830 or 1831, because that's when he was writing a lot of his science fiction-ish type work. Now, first off, I want to show you what I believe Matthew looked like around this time. We're talking 18, 19, 20 years old when he was editing the New York Constellation, and I've just shown you why I believe that he was editing that paper and not just writing for it. His editor-in-chief was Asa Green, and the books that he wrote after he left the Constellation and that paper folded were also credited by historians to Asa Green. The paper was written by Matthew Franklin Whittier. The books, all 5 of them, were written by Matthew Franklin Whittier. Matthew was the man behind the scenes. So where shall we start here? First of all, this is one of the books that was written by Matthew after he left the Constellation. There was a cholera epidemic in 1832. He left New York City, apparently, and he wrote these books. This is The Life and Adventures of Dr. Dodemus Duckworth. It is a satire on quack medicine, which is relevant because the Some Words with a Mummy ends as a satire on quack medicine. Matthew returned to this theme many times, so this was typical for him. It's assumed to be Asa Green's because Asa Green was a medical doctor, but I think Matthew and Asa Green were simpatico on this particular issue. So this is volume 2. And let's see, I had picked out an excerpt, but I think I just lost it. So let's just randomly open here. That's talking about his marriage. This is done like a straight biography, you know. Okay, it took me quite a while to find something because I don't want to read a whole lot. This little chapter here talks about Dr. Duckworth's competition, the other quacks. So he's talking now about Dr. Horehound, the herbalist. This is from an era when Matthew, as I said, was very skeptical still. So we're talking early 1830s. This was published, I think it's 1834, 33. Anyway, but strong as were Dr. Horhound's professions against the use of opium and mercury, they used both back then, he was suspected on more than one occasion to have used both. This he is said to have effected by ingeniously combining them with things of a plastic nature so that they could easily be molded into the form of roots in which character they were imposed upon the patient. But the friends and admirers of Dr. Horhound declared that this was all a fabrication got up by his enemies among the regular part of the faculty, who, finding that they could not put him down by fair means, resorted to this foul slander to effect their object. Besides the annoyance of Poltoggle and Horhound, those are his competitors, who showed themselves in Crinkumpaw too frequently for the peace, pleasure, and good digestion of Dr. Duckworth, there was a cancer curer, or doctoress as she was called, within a few miles of him, who added still further to his vexation. Mrs. Dumps, a short little woman, 4 feet 1, with a great hunch on her back, was famous in all that region for curing lumps, bumps, and tumors, which she did under the frightful appellation of cancers. She did not profess any skill in other diseases, nor was she supposed to possess any, but the firm belief among her employers was that she was inspired with the knowledge of the symptoms and the cure of that most dreadful of all complaints, the cancer. In other words, she'd take any tumor, pronounce it cancer, and then cure it. So that just gives you a quick idea. I also want to establish that Matthew was writing science fiction in this early period. So this is, I believe, the 1832 edition, one of the editions of the New England Magazine, which was edited by his former editor in the New England Galaxy, Joseph T. Buckingham. I don't have the date written down here. I'm looking for it. Oh, this is the December 1831 edition. And here we have something that might be of interest to people who study Edgar Allan Poe. It's called The Orangutan. Now, I really haven't done my homework here because I know that Edgar Allan Poe is famous for having written about an orangutan, but this is earlier. So I have to put up on the screen when Poe first wrote about an orangutan. This is unsigned by style. I am absolutely certain that it's Matthew's work. And this is a letter introducing a letter. This is typical of Matthew to nest a letter within a letter. So this person who is not signing, he's got 2 blanks for signature, is sending in a letter written by the orangutan who is in a zoo or something there. So this letter was written by an orangutan to her boyfriend or husband, I think it was. And it's quite clever because it's all social commentary. So the orangutan talks about human society and human beings. See, philosophical type piece. Well, I won't read it. I just wanted you to know that that's in there and that Matthew probably was the originator of this idea of, of writing about or writing as an orangutan. Now, we get into the next volume. This is the next volume of the New England Magazine. And we go to, let's see, I think this is January 1832, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a poem by Z. Now, Matthew wrote a piece that I'm almost sure is his under XYZ, which is a signature he used later on, many years later. But it occurred to me he also wrote as Z. So this is a hymn to Plutus, imitated from the Greek, and it's a sarcastic hymn to wealth, about how this person would do anything and sacrifice anything for wealth. And it's Matthew writing sarcastically, signing as Z, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't think I am. I was earlier going to show you a picture of what Matthew looked like. I don't know if I finished that thought. I'm kind of scattered today. This portrait, I believe, is Matthew as a young man when he was writing for the Constellation. It came all the way from Montevideo in South America. There is a rational explanation as to how it could have gotten there. I don't even know whether this one is a fake or real, but the image is real. The actual thing itself may have been a copy. I think that Matthew had this done I think that they swapped portraits. I think that Matthew had a sailor friend who came into New York City, and they went out for a night on the town, had their portraits done and swapped them, and this one ended up in South America. It seems far-fetched, but I'm telling you, my intuition tells me over and over and over and over when I look at this is Matthew. So this is the guy that's writing this science fiction. Here we're really getting into the meat of this thing. This is called A Legend of Christmas Eve, and it's signed Z. I'm 100% certain that this is Matthew's by style, and I'm going to read it. It starts out with a quote. Coriolanus is the person he's quoting. I shall tell you a prosing tale. It may be you have heard it, but since it serves my purpose, I will venture to scale it a little more. And he begins. I'll read a little bit of this just to give you an idea, and you can compare this style with some words with the mummy. I believe these would have been written about the same time. The conjurer sat at his books. The various utensils of his art were scattered around him. A horoscope, globe, astrolabe, and quadrant, and huge volumes of mysterious characters and an unknown tongue. He was an adept in the black art, shrewdly conversant with whatever might excite the superstition of the credulous, and usually made his calculations with a sagacity that baffled detection. The old man was poring over one of these tomes when he raised his keen gray eye from the volume as the door opened, and a stranger presented himself. He was of small stature, attired in a rustic garb, his visage thin and wrinkled, and his little black eyes hardly separated by an attenuated apology for a nose. The intruder stood silent for a few moments, as if hesitating how to address the man of forbidden knowledge. He that would consult the stars, said the conjurer, must view them in a mirror of silver. The book of fate is sealed to him who comes empty-handed. At this hint, the stranger drew from his pocket a well-worn purse of heart case, and fingering the contents of the bag, deposited a few small coins in the palm of the conjurer. I would know, said he, if there is money buried on the great island down the river. He of the horoscope opened one of the huge volumes of mystery, and began slowly turning the leaves with great care. Apparently unsatisfied, he handled the astrolabe for a few moments, and at length fell to figuring with earnestness. There is gold there which may not be touched by mortal hands, said he, suspending his calculations. It is the charmed treasure of the pirate. I dreamed it, said the visitor, leaning towards the table and casting a furtive glance at the talisman. But is there no way? Have you not power to disenchant it? Where is it buried? And so on. Turns out there is treasure. The ghosts of the pirates come. He's been told by the conjurer that if he doesn't say anything, he can take the treasure, but if he utters a sound, that'll be it for him. See, well, he does at the last minute say something, and that's the end of him. It's a science fiction fantasy horror story. It's called A Legend of Christmas Eve. That's Matthew. That's Matthew in 1831, writing in essentially the same style. Notice his sarcasm and his cynicism about astrology, about all things woo-woo. This was the time when he was disparaging the things that Abby believed in and that she was trying to teach him, because she was a student of the paranormal. She had prescient dreams. She was psychic, and so on. She brought Matthew around over the years, but in this early period, he was cynical. So you see that same cynicism about quack doctors and other matters in Some Words with a Mummy. The same sense of humor, the same clever plot ideas. You know, that's Matthew. That is not Edgar Allan Poe. So that's some of our examples. Now what I'm going to do is to go through my notes, because I took detailed notes about this story, Some Words with a Mummy. And then I'm going to show you something else which reflects Matthew's interest in Benjamin Franklin. So here I have said first off that the humor in the introduction is typical of Matthew, and to the extent that it's drawn from life, it probably would have been written when he was married to Abby, but later on I concluded that it was not. It was written in imagination about a married couple, but it was written as a poor man, which he was. He lived in boarding houses and just barely got by, and so he was a tall guy. He was 6'2" and had a heck of an appetite, but here he's eating Welch rarebit, you know, and he was also drinking stout, which is to say beer, and in the early days Matthew did drink. Later on he became a teetotaler. So I'm just trying to nail down the time. That this person's narrator's sleep was aided by a good conscience would be typical of Matthew's worldview. He was raised Quaker. He believed that if you didn't have anything troubling you, that you could sleep well. Although, ironically, he had insomnia. Then there's a line, but when were the hopes of humanity fulfilled? Which is kind of a philosophical statement. That's typical of Matthew. I'm just running down the list. Matthew had a very strong interest in the sciences. He would have kept up with things like archaeology. If people were unearthing mummies and it came into the news, he would have been very interested by that. Now, there's a reference to a battery, the voltaic pile. That's from 1800. That is Alessandro Volta, who invented it in 1800. But then in 1836, the Daniell cell was invented. In 1837, Bird's cell was invented. And then in 1838 was the porous pot cell. So anybody writing this after, say, 1836, who was keeping up with the most current, and that's what this is supposed to be, the inference is this is the most current, they would have used one of those. They wouldn't have used the voltaic pile. See, so this was written quite a long time before it was submitted. See, this is way before 1845. I think it's 1830. Now, the reaction of the scientists to when the mummy comes to life, that's typical of Matthew's humor. I don't think Edgar Allan Poe is really known for humor. If it is, it's very biting, but it's not this kind of whimsical humor like what you see with Matthew. This is kind of humor is all through Matthew's works from 1825 all the way to 1875, 50 years. Now, there's a section where in order to wake up the mummy, they make an incision at the tip of his nose and shock him. Well, Matthew had a bulbous tip on the end of his nose, which I don't have in this lifetime. I seem to have gotten rid of it. He hated it, considered himself unsightly because of that bulbous tip. I seem to remember that he used to kind of stroke it like that in thought, hoping he could get rid of it, which apparently he did now. But in this story, they shock that end of the nose and pull on it. See, well, Matthew has referred to nose pulling before. And the inference, I think, is that people did pull his nose, bullies and so on, see, and made fun of it. So I think that's a little autobiographical reference thrown in there. Now, one of the characters is named Silk Buckingham, and Matthew's editor was Joseph T. Buckingham. He could have put that in as a kind of a dig to him, a little tease. I'll go out on a limb here and say that Buckingham here, Silk Buckingham, is represented as having a wig, and his wig comes off or is used or something, and he's embarrassed. Well, I feel that the Mr. Fezziwig character in A Christmas Carol was patterned on Buckingham. So if Buckingham actually did wear a wig, and Matthew is actually teasing him about it, then that would be why he's named Fezziwig in A Christmas Carol. That's going out on a limb now. That's speculation, obviously. But these things do tie together. I'm now working with something I don't have any proof for. So this is all just, speculative evidence, but nonetheless, it's circumstantial evidence. Now, there's a joke in here about conveying to the mummy what is meant by politics by drawing a picture of somebody giving a stump speech, an impassioned stump speech. Well, Matthew many times made fun of stump speeches, including in his Ethan Spike character. I've told you about one where Ethan Spike is giving a speech as a white supremacist, but I don't think that was a stump speech, but he gives stump speeches, and Matthew liked to make fun of them. So that would be consistent. Now, I've got a quote here. Mr. Glidden, I really am ashamed to hear you talk in this style, said the Count, meaning the mummy, resuming his chair. No nation upon the face of the earth has ever acknowledged more than one god. They were talking about gods. The scarabus, the ibis, etc., were with us, as similar creatures have been with others, the symbols or media through which we offered worship to a creator, capital C, too august to be more directly approached. That's Abbey. That's Abbey, who has studied mysticism and believes that all of these other cultures, even Hinduism, which talks about many gods, it's really all meant under the umbrella of the one God, or as aspects or archetypes of the one God. See? So Matthew would have gotten that from Abbey. This is not something that Edgar Allan Poe was not really mystical, and he was not really religious or spiritual. He faked it in Eureka, the poem, but he really wasn't. Matter of fact, he didn't truck with the transcendentalist at all, as I understand. And that's because he was a worldly sociopath. He really wasn't a spiritual person. There's no reason why he would bring in this real metaphysics into this story if he had written it. I mean, it would be 1,000 to 1 chance that he would bring in something real as opposed to just something fanciful. Now, there's a gag regarding one's legacy having been distorted by commentary after several hundred years, so the mummies are being revived so they can set things straight. That would be very typical of Matthew, to be thinking in the long term about his legacy. That's what I'm doing now, having reincarnated, and I'm trying to set his legacy straight. So in a particular sense, I am doing what he talked about with these mummies. You know, it shows once again that Matthew was looking long term with regard to his legacy. That's why he left all of these clues. Now, there's an example of the Kabbalah being entirely wrong, that there's nothing in it that's authentic anymore, that hasn't been distorted. That's Abby also. Abby would have studied the Kabbalah along with Hermeticism, but she must have decided that this is all wonkerjaws. This is all off. It's all been distorted. So I had long felt that Abby must have studied that, but that must have been her opinion. Again, this is these are the opinions secondhand from Abby of somebody who's really studied, which Poe had not. Now, let's see, the 13th point I've got here is the mummies' assertion that their own science was far superior but had been forgotten. That also would reflect Abby's study. See, these things are just now coming out in the New Age. You know, if you get on YouTube and read books and so on, you'll find that these things are coming out. Abby had studied these things back in 1830. You know, 1825, 1830. She was already familiar with the fact that there are these ages, these yugas, which the Hindus talk about, and that originally the Egyptians had been part of a very advanced culture, but that it had been forgotten. You know, you get on YouTube and look at like Mystery History 2. Check that out. You'll see what I'm talking about. Now, 14, the joke is that the mummy is unimpressed with any instance of modern technology which their professors cite, until finally they cite 2 instances of quack medicine, and then the mummy's beaten. Now, did Poe put that in, or I think Matthew put that in, you know, as satire? And but it's the next to last paragraph, which is Matthew's ending. So let's, if I've got it marked, which of course I don't. Now we're going to be a little pause here while I find it again. Okay, I found it. Now I'm going to read you the next to last paragraph, which I believe is the way Matthew ended it. And then I'm going to read you the last paragraph, which I think that Poe added. As I've said, this is exactly the same situation you find in A Christmas Carol. So the next to last one reads, "We looked with profound anxiety for an answer, but in vain. It was not forthcoming. The Egyptian blushed and hung down his head. Never was triumph more consummate. Never was defeat borne with so ill a grace. Indeed, I could not endure the spectacle of the poor mummy's mortification. I reached my hat, bowed to him stiffly, and took leave." That would have been the end. See, the mummy, he can't beat this quack medicine, and he's speechless, and he leaves. That would have been Matthew's ending. Now the last one that I think Poe added, "Upon getting home," see, now he's got to tack on something. "Upon getting home, I found it past 4 o'clock and went immediately to bed. It is now 10 a.m. I have been up since 7, penning these memoranda for the benefit of my family and of mankind. The former I shall behold no more. My wife is a shrew. The truth is, I am heartily sick of this life and of the 19th century in general. I am convinced that everything is going wrong. Besides, I am anxious to know who will be president in 2045. As soon, therefore, as I shave and swallow a cup of coffee, I shall just step over to Ponnonner's," that's his scientist friend, "and get embalmed for a couple of 100 years." Well, it's clever. It kind of gets away from the theme of the thing, which was quack medicine. But he's talking about leaving his wife and his family. because his wife is a shrew, but he's going to leave his children also. This is what I mean when I say that if you see in a work that looks like Matthew's or in one of Matthew's works, cruelty to animals or to children or to anybody, that's somebody else. That's not Matthew. So here he's being cruel to his children at the very least. He would not have characterized his wife as a shrew. I'm pretty sure. He didn't make fun of marriage per se. And he certainly wouldn't have had his main character leave his children because his wife was a shrew, see? So also now in 1842, 43, and onwards to 1845, Matthew was married to a woman who really was a shrew. But he wouldn't have put that in print, I don't think. And he loved his children dearly, so he never would have written about leaving his children, with no remorse whatsoever. See, this is the sociopath who doesn't care. See? So I would say that Poe added that last paragraph because he just didn't think that Matthew's ending was good enough. So that's my analysis of that story. When we get into Columbian Magazine, you will see that Matthew writes about Benjamin Franklin, a nice little essay about Benjamin Franklin, and then there's a couple other little biographical sketches that I think are Matthew's, but I was certain about Benjamin Franklin. So we'll talk about that, but I want to show a little precedent. So that's 1845. He probably wrote it in 1845. But in the News and Courier, which is in Amesbury, Massachusetts, on the January 4th, 1838 edition, there is a little biography about Ben Franklin, and it reads very similarly. So just to give a little background, Matthew and Abby had been living in Dover, New Hampshire, to which town they had eloped from Haverhill, Massachusetts in August of 1836. They'd lived there about a year and a half. They had written very strong pro-abolition letters to the editor, a series of 10 rebutting somebody else's series of 10. And they'd been found out, I believe, and they'd been run out of town, as near as I can tell. So they went back to Amesbury, Massachusetts, Amesbury Mills, technically, where his brother and family had moved to after they'd sold the farm. And Matthew began as a clerk, apparently, for this newspaper, the News and Courier, and he does mention it in correspondence to his brother. So there's no question that he was working as a clerk for this paper. That's not my imagination. However, this article on Franklin is unsigned, but it's pretty much a no-brainer that Matthew, who we know was working for the News and Courier, wrote this unsigned article about his namesake, Benjamin Franklin. It's not much of a stretch. Now I'm going to compare the writing of these two, okay? And the whole purpose of this is to establish that that is Matthew Franklin Whittier, who has a presence in the Columbian, where Some Words with a Mummy was supposed to appear and didn't, before Edgar Allan Poe's version came out in April in a different magazine. So here's how he starts. It says, and there's a nice drawing of Franklin, which I'll show you here. And then he says, "What? Live in Philadelphia and not know our Ben?" said the mother of Franklin. And with equal surprise should we exclaim, did we think any reader in enlightened Christendom did not know our Ben, of whom America may proudly boast, the self-instructed statesman and philosopher, the Republican in theory and practice, that's liberals, who received the ridicule of the parasites of St. James and the flatteries of the court of Versailles with equal complacency, and the philosopher for his fellow men, whether in composing maxims or experimenting with the forked lightnings. Now, Matthew was a philosopher who was also interested in science. He really admired Benjamin Franklin a great deal and patterned himself after him quite a bit. So then he says, we exhibit him above, not, quote, an old man in specs, but a benevolent, thinking philosopher as he was, wisdom seated on his brow, and benevolence beaming from his face, a forehead for reflection, and an eye for searching out hidden things, and his whole countenance as one who had squared his conduct with his conscience, and was quietly sitting down to reflect upon a well-spent life. Now, whenever Matthew praised someone, he generally projected his own ideals onto that person. So now we see what Matthew's own ideals are. a benevolent, thinking philosopher, wisdom seated on his brow, and benevolence beaming from his face, a forehead for reflection, and an eye for searching out hidden things, and his whole countenance as one who had squared his conduct with his conscience. Remember, Matthew was raised Quaker, and was quietly sitting down to reflect upon a well-spent life. Well, it goes on like that. It ends with the epitaph, which Benjamin Franklin wrote as a boy. And there's variations on this. There's one variation that's used by Head and Cranston in their book about reincarnation, which indicates that Benjamin Franklin believed in reincarnation. Actually, he did. I have a copy of a letter, not a photograph copy, but there is a letter that Benjamin Franklin wrote to a friend late in life, which makes it very, very clear that he believed in reincarnation. So I have that on my website. I can link to it here. But this epitaph, as Matthew quoted it, reads, and it's not the reincarnation-friendly version, it's the heaven-friendly version. The body of Benjamin Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here food for worms, yet the work itself shall not be lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more beautiful edition, corrected and amended by the author. Well, the more beautiful edition suggests heaven, but in a new and improved edition, or whatever the other versions say, sounds like reincarnation, see? So Matthew, quote, was not a believer in reincarnation, so he quoted the heaven-friendly version. And then the author, I believe, says, so we believe the same Spirit has already appeared on high, italics, and in a new and more beautiful edition, corrected and amended by the author as above. So Matthew may have been aware of the reincarnation interpretation, and he weighs in with this version, meaning that it's heaven, okay? So that was definitely Matthew, and when the Columbian magazine gets in and I read for you the little biographical sketch that Matthew writes, unsigned, I believe, for the Columbian, you'll see that it's also him. And I've made it clear that Matthew did return to his previous ideas. So this is 1838, and then when it comes to 1845, Matthew writes another little biography in a very similar vein for the Columbian. But the question is, why did the Columbian announce in the January edition that Some Words with a Mummy was going to be in their magazine, presumably in the February edition, and then it doesn't show up? And then in April, Poe's version shows up in American Review. How in the world could that have ever happened? Well, I'm not sure, but let's say that Matthew shared Some Words with a Mummy and gave Edgar Allan Poe a copy in the first half of 1842, the same time that he gave him The Raven and Annabel Lee. Come 1845, in January, Matthew is sending some of these pieces. You know, The Raven goes to American Review. Some Words with a Mummy goes to the Columbian in January, both. See, and so The Raven doesn't get published until February, which gives Poe just enough time to scoop it in the Evening Mirror. And this one doesn't get published at all. So, and then Poe manages to get it in American Review, which editor thinks Poe wrote The Raven at that time, see? So Poe must have, first of all, tricked everybody into thinking that he'd written The Raven. And then he, now having established himself as the false writer of The Raven, he now gets wind that, I guess he probably reads the January edition of the Columbian, and he sees that Some Words with a Mummy is coming out, and he tells the editor, that's mine, somebody has stolen it. You know, don't print that because that's mine. He doesn't want Matthew's version to come out, see. For one thing, Matthew may have signed it, something that would have pointed to him. So he says, don't print it, I've revised it, you know, somebody else has taken it, and in other words, he'd flip everything around and say that somebody's stolen it from him and revised it. So then he would take his revised version, submit it to American Review, who now thinks that he was the editor of the author of The Raven, and it would get published in American Review and not get published in the Columbian. That's what I think happened. It's really a case of early identity theft. you know, where Poe took the pieces that he had been given by Matthew for samples and assumed the identity of the author and then shut Matthew out. That's why Poe never published Annabel Lee in his lifetime, because Matthew, seeing these two instances, must have threatened him and said, you know, to himself, he says, I can't go public because I'll put at risk all of these people I'm working with that are involved in the Underground Railroad and everything else. But Annabel Lee is a deeply personal poem about Abby's death, which involves, as I've said, that idiosyncratic detail that has to do with the highborn kinsman coming and taking her away, which was literal for Matthew, because Abby's father was a marquis and her highborn two sisters did in fact come and take her back to her family home about a week before she died. So that was literal. So Matthew must have threatened Poe. I will expose you if you dare publish Annabel Lee. And therefore Annabel Lee, as good as it was, and everybody agrees that that's like that and The Raven are his best poems, he never published it in his lifetime. That's why. It wasn't that he wrote it right before his death at all. So there you have that. I think I've covered everything until the Columbian comes in the mail, and then I'll sign on briefly to show that to you. Okay, the mail came. The mailman actually handed it to me. I went down after like the 6th or 7th time. He came in the door and handed it to me. Here is the Columbian magazine, which I think you can probably see there. And it's in pretty good shape, you know, foxing and faded and various things that one expects, a little character. But this has, first of all, it has notices to correspondence right after the editors talk about the engravings. There it is, notices to correspondence. It's in the January edition. It's page 45 on the bottom. The following articles are accepted, viz., Death of Marco Bozzaris, The Deaf Girl in Church, Tears separated with dashes, The Double Ruse, An Hour in the Nursery, Highland Adventure, To a Transplanted Flower, First Love, and Some Words with a Mummy. So there it is. It's supposed to be coming out. And then he goes on, let's see, the articles not here named are respectfully declined, though some of them are from our very good friends, these are like major authors at the time, who we hope will renew their efforts to please us, bearing in mind that we wish to present the very best magazine in the Union, that we hope each contributor will write for fame and immortality, little thinking of the poor compensation to be received at our hands, though we intend that shall be liberal. Now remember that at least one person I know of wrote that he thought Poe had pulled it from this magazine and submitted to American Review because American Review paid better. Well, that's kind of a nasty trick in and of itself if he did that. So if we're going to go there, we might as well go all the way and say that, you know, he stole the story in the first place. But I don't think these guys paid poorly because they've got major authors in here. Lydia Sigourney is in here. This is the first edition. T.S. Arthur is in here. I mean, for the times, these are big authors. So apparently they rejected some of them. Fanny Forster, you know, these are like major authors of the time. So it's a very strange business. That they would have announced it and then not published it. We seek to make it a pleasure for our readers to go a mile at least out of their way to get, quote, the Columbian each month, and when they have read it, impatient to see it the succeeding month. So something went down. We don't know what it was. Now, here's one of their engravings. I think I can do this without damaging it. This is Benjamin Franklin flying a kite. Then we go on a little bit further. There's a review of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, her American 1845 publication, Drama of Exile, which was the same as her 1844 publication called Poems in England. And that's the one that has 4, at least, of Matthew's poems that she plagiarized. But unlike some of the literati in Europe, according to her correspondence with her friend, this reviewer likes her own poetry. He only mentions briefly one of Matthew's, the one that people have remarked looks a lot like the style of the Raven, and that's Lady Geraldine's Courtship. So they say, well, no, they mention sleep too, a child asleep. So let's see. She says, Cowper's grave and sleep have a low, and music at once real and affecting, while many of the lines in Geraldine sing nobly and sweet. Well, that's it. The other ones are all presumably, unless she stole them from other people, those are the ones that she wrote herself. So she gets some points with that reviewer. I don't think that was the general opinion, though. Then we have descriptions for the engravings, and it has the title, and underneath it says, see the engraving. Apparently, Matthew wrote all 3 of these. I have only mentioned the one about Benjamin Franklin because I can show that Matthew had written about Benjamin Franklin. That's his namesake. He very much admired Franklin, and that's a pretty strong one. There's 3 others. I think Matthew had taken on the job as a freelancer of describing the engravings. Normally, I think that was done by the editors. But I'm telling you, by style, this is Matthew. So I strongly feel that Matthew was the one that took on the job as a freelancer of writing the descriptions for the engravings. Now, I've said this before, but Matthew would take the lowliest position on a publication, like he did in the Daily Delta, writing the police office, like he did in the Dial, writing the reviews. And then he would make of it literature, so it was actually better than the submitted work by other people, you know? So here we have the philosopher and his kite, and then the desertion of Sergeant Champ, which was not something that Matthew would have really been behind, but he kind of deals with it. You know, he shoulders the responsibility and does admirably. And then the birthplace of Washington is very, very short. I'm going to read that first because I think it's kind of interesting, because this is Matthew's take on it, see? The birthplace of Washington, see the engraving. By a natural impulse of the heart, the reverence with which we look upon great men, benefactors of their kind and shedding luster by their actions upon humanity, extends itself in some degree to objects with which they have been closely connected. That's a little philosophical introduction, typical for Matthew. The house in which Washington was born is no longer in existence. Its site is indicated by a slab of stone bearing an inscription that declares the fact. It stood near the junction of Polk's Creek with the Potomac in Westmoreland County, Virginia. A few years after his birth, it was either burned or taken down for some then existing reason. Mr. Paulding says of the locality, quote, a few scanty relics alone remain to mark the spot which will ever be sacred in the eyes of posterity, a clump of old decayed fig trees, probably coeval, I don't know that word, C-O-E-V-A-L, coeval with the mansion, yet exist, and a number of vines and shrubs and flowers still reproduce themselves every year as if to mark the site and flourish among the hollowed ruins. So Matthew quotes somebody else to praise Washington. He doesn't do it himself. I think he's lukewarm about Washington. So he really kind of says something philosophical and neutral himself, which was, a kind of a sociological view of, how great men are marked by certain objects. On the other hand, when he gets to Benjamin Franklin, it sounds very much like the one I read to you earlier from the News and Courier. I'm going to read a little of that. It is scarcely possible, nay, it is not possible, that any reader of the Columbian Magazine requires to be told who the philosopher was or why he amused himself with one of the toys of boyhood. And even if one reader so much behind the intelligence of the age could be supposed to exist, the accessories of the picture would suggest to him that the kite was not raised for pastime. People do not go out to fly kites in thunderstorms, and the key appended to the string would, in the present state and diffusion of scientific knowledge, sufficiently convey the idea that the seeming sport was really an experiment. And what a glorious experiment it was! What an impulse it gave in a moment, as it were, to the progress of scientific inquiry. Franklin, the self-taught philosopher of the young republic, had conceived the bold idea that the electricity of the cylinder and the Leyden jar was the electricity also of the thundercloud, that the spark which darted from the points of the conductor was identical with the forked lightning that gleams and blazes fearfully athwart the blackness of the tempest. This small type, and it's a little bit rubbed, so it's hard to read. So anyway, you can see how enthusiastic he is about Franklin versus his very neutral take on Washington. And note the way that he starts with a question, kind of a rhetorical question, just exactly as he did in the 1838 piece. There he said, could anybody not know, who our Ben is, And here he says, is it scarcely possible, nay, it is not possible, that any reader of the Columbian Magazine requires to be told who the philosopher was, and note he calls him a philosopher just like he did before, or why he amused himself with one of the toys of boyhood. He almost plagiarized himself, I would say. It's that close. He basically took his old article and rewrote it, at least for the introduction. So it's pretty clear that Matthew had a presence in this magazine doing kind of one of the editor's jobs, one of the lowliest of the low, which was just to describe the illustrations. And yet his piece, Some Words with a Mummy, was supposed to appear in this February edition and didn't, which is very strange. I can't think of any other instance like that. I've been studying these old publications for 11 years. I've got a ton of them, and I've looked into a ton more that were online. I don't know, hundreds, And I can't ever think of a situation where the editor announces that something has been accepted and then doesn't print it. There are cases where the editor will say it's on file, it's under consideration, something like that. And then it might not appear. If it's on file, it may be shelved. If it's going to appear sometime, the editor will say that. Never can I ever remember having seen the editor including it in a group that's definitely been accepted and then it doesn't come out. So something weird went down there, something very unusual. And again, the only thing I can think of, if it was indeed Matthew's, which I think I've shown that it very likely was, and intuitively I know it was, Poe had to have seen the January edition. He had to have seen that it was coming out. He had his copy from 1842 when he was given a copy of that and The Raven and Annabel Lee. And he had already successfully managed to steal The Raven. So he figured that he would preempt Matthew with Some Words with a Mummy as well. And he must have gotten in touch with that editor and must have shown him his physical copy and said, this is my story. This guy, the person that submitted it to you, whoever it was, because Matthew would have done it anonymously probably, said, this guy stole it from me. It's not really his, and you can't publish it. And then he proceeded to publish it in American Review, where already he had a reputation for supposedly being the author of The Raven, and he wanted to keep pumping up his reputation. So it's very interesting. Now, people that don't want to believe me, that want to go into denial about all the evidence that I have, and this is the least strongly proven of all of them, they will bat this away like they bat everything else away, and that's fine. They're welcome to do that. But someday it will be understood, And in the little museum that I hope is someday constructed for Matthew and Abby's legacy, this will be in it, and it will be one of the important ones because of the clue that it has in it. Thanks for watching.